The night I watched my son hand his credit card to his wife without being asked, and then thank her for letting him keep $20 for the week, I understood something that made the room feel very small. I had spent 31 years as a forensic accountant. I had traced hidden money through shell companies, offshore accounts, and falsified records. I had testified in federal court. I had helped put people in prison for financial crimes that destroyed lives quietly, without a single bruise showing. I never imagined I would need that training to protect my own child. My name is Carol Whitfield. I am 63 years old. I live outside Nashville, Tennessee, in a house my late husband built with his hands, and I raised my son in rooms where the doors were never locked and the windows were always open. I did not raise a man who apologized for breathing. So when I started seeing him do exactly that, I did not panic. I began to watch. My son was 31 when this started unraveling in front of me. He had always been the kind of person who filled a room without trying, not loud, not boastful, just present in a way that made people feel steadier. He became an architect because he believed buildings told the truth about what people valued. He used to say that you could understand a family by the way they designed their home, whether they built walls or windows, whether light was welcome or kept out. He laughed easily. He argued thoughtfully. He called me every Sunday morning without fail, sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes for an hour. He was my son, and I knew him the way only a mother can. Not just his words, but the air around him when something was wrong. He met his wife at a firm retreat in Asheville 3 years before all of this came to a head. She was sharp and polished, the kind of woman who made everything look effortless. She laughed at exactly the right moments. She remembered details, the way he took his coffee, the name of his first dog, the year his father died. I noticed that early. At the time, I called it attentiveness. Later, I would understand it differently. She was not falling in love. She was building a file. The first year looked beautiful from the outside. She encouraged him. She told him he was the most talented person she had ever met. She attended his presentations and stood at the back of the room with an expression that made him feel seen. He told me once that she was the first person who made him feel like his ambition was not too much. I should have asked more questions about what that meant. I should have asked why he had ever believed his ambition was something to be managed at all. They married in the spring. Small ceremony, backyard, fairy lights strung between oak trees. Her mother, Beverly, stood near the front in a pale green dress, pearls at her throat, smiling in the careful way of someone who has practiced it. I shook her hand. It was cold. I told myself I was imagining things. The changes came slowly. They always do. He stopped calling on Sunday mornings. When I asked, he said they had started spending Sundays together, just the two of them, and that she needed that time to decompress from the week. I told myself that was fair. Newlyweds needed rituals. I told myself I was adjusting to sharing him, but then the Wednesday calls stopped too, and then the random texts about nothing, the kind that only happen between people who feel easy with each other. The silence grew in the spaces where his voice used to be. When I saw him at Thanksgiving, 6 months after the wedding, something was different in his posture. Not dramatic, not obvious. The way a tree looks after a bad storm, still standing, still leafed, but leaning slightly in a direction it was not meant to lean. He laughed at his wife's jokes before they finished. He checked her face before answering my questions. He used phrases I had never heard from him before. Things like, "We prefer not to," and "That's not really our style anymore." Our, as if his singular self had been quietly absorbed into something that now required permission to speak. Her mother, Beverly, came to Christmas that year. She arrived with wine she had selected, rearranged flowers my son had put on the table, and spent the evening offering corrections in the key of helpfulness. She told me the gravy needed more salt. She told my son that men who let their wives handle the finances showed real emotional intelligence. She said it lightly, over dinner, like a woman dropping a seed into already prepared soil. My son nodded. He had heard it before. I could tell by the speed of the nod. After dinner, I found him in the kitchen alone, washing dishes. I stood beside him. We did not speak for a moment. Then I asked him how work was going. He paused, hands still in the water. "Fine," he said. "She thinks I should scale back the independent projects. Focus on the firm. More stable." I asked if that was what he wanted. He was quiet for 3 seconds too long. "It makes sense right now," he said. And then he smiled at me, and the smile did not reach his eyes. I dried the dishes and did not push, but I counted those 3 seconds for a long time afterward. By the following spring, the financial picture had shifted in ways I only understood because I knew what to look for. My son had always been careful with money. He saved early, invested modestly, kept clean records the way I had taught him. He had his own accounts when he married, a healthy cushion, no debt. Now when I asked about a vacation they had canceled, he said they were restructuring their finances. When I asked if he needed anything, he said they were fine, but the word fine came out thin, stretched over something heavier than fine ever weighs. I did not ask more. Not yet. Instead, I paid attention. I noticed that she answered questions directed at him in restaurants. I noticed that when she spoke, his body stilled, the way a person stills when they have learned that movement draws attention. I noticed that when I complimented his work, he deflected to her, said she had pushed him to take that project, said she saw the opportunity first, said it all with a gratitude that had curdled at the edges into something closer to debt. The moment I stopped telling myself I was imagining things came on an ordinary afternoon in September. I dropped by without calling, something I rarely do. I knocked, and he answered the door with a look I had never seen on my son's face before. Not surprise, not irritation. Fear. For just a fraction of a second, before his face rearranged itself. My son looked afraid to see his mother standing on his front porch. She appeared behind him before I could say anything. Her expression was smooth and welcoming. "What a nice surprise," she said, in a tone that was neither nice nor surprised. We had coffee. She stayed in the room the entire time. Every question I asked him, she answered or redirected. When I mentioned a story about his childhood, something warm and small, she said, "He's told me that one," and then moved the conversation elsewhere. When I stood to leave and hugged him, I felt how tightly he held on. Not the hug of a man who was fine, but the hug of someone who did not want to let go. In the car, I sat for a long time before starting the engine. He was not unhappy. I began to document, quietly, carefully, the way I had been trained. I wrote down dates. I noted things he said, things he did not say, the words that were his and the ones that sounded borrowed. I called an old colleague who worked in family law and asked hypothetical questions over lunch. I did not tell him why. I listened more than I spoke. 3 months later, my son called me on a Tuesday night. She was out. I could tell by the way he breathed differently, a little more space in each sentence. He told me he had asked her that week if he could take on a freelance commission, something small, a design for a community center in the neighborhood where we had grown up. She said no. She said it created liability. She said it was a distraction from what they were building together. She said he had a tendency to overextend himself emotionally on projects that did not serve their future. He told me he agreed with her. But he called me at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday while she was out, and his voice sounded like a man standing at the bottom of a very deep well, describing the light he remembered seeing at the top. I told him I loved him. I told him his father would have been proud of the man he was. I said nothing else that night, but after I hung up, I opened the notebook I had been keeping, and I wrote one sentence at the top of a new page. "This is not about money. This is about elimination. The dinner happened in November, at Beverly's house, a pre-Thanksgiving gathering with her side of the family. I was invited because my son had insisted. I came because I wanted to see the system in its natural setting. Beverly hosted with the precision of a woman who has practiced power in domestic spaces for a very long time. The house was beautiful and airless. Everything was arranged to impress, and nothing was placed for comfort. The guests moved around her carefully. Her daughter moved around her the same way, only faster, like a woman who had spent years learning which floorboards creaked. During dinner, my son made a small joke. It was a good joke, easy and warm, the kind he used to make freely. The table laughed. Beverly smiled at her daughter. The smile said something I could not translate yet. After dinner, while the others moved to the living room, I went to find a glass of water and heard voices from the kitchen. Beverly and her daughter, speaking in low tones, unhurried, as if in a meeting that had been running for years. I did not move. Beverly was saying that he was getting comfortable again. That comfortable meant careless. That careless meant independent. That independent, she said, in a tone I will not forget, was something they could not afford to let settle in again. Her daughter said she knew. She said she was handling it. Beverly said the accounts needed to be consolidated before the end of the year. All of them. There was a pause. Her daughter said it would be done. I walked back to the hallway with my glass of water and stood there for a moment, with my heart beating in a way it had not beaten since the last time I sat across from someone in a deposition who thought I did not know what I knew. I went home that night and I called no one. Instead, I opened my laptop and I began to work the way I had worked for 3 decades, methodically, without emotion. Because emotion was a luxury I could not afford right now, not if I wanted to get my son out. What I found took 2 weeks to fully understand. The financial structure they had built around my son was elegant, in a terrible way. Joint accounts he had signed over voluntarily, believing it was partnership. A power of attorney document, broad in its language, that had been presented to him during a stressful work period as a practical measure. Contracts co-signed in both names but with sole decision-making clauses buried in the language. His name was everywhere, and his authority was nowhere. It was not illegal. Not yet. I needed one more thing before I made my move. I needed to know whether this was the first time. I hired a researcher, someone I had worked with before, quiet and thorough. I gave her Beverly's name, her daughter's name, and enough years of history to start pulling threads. The call came on a Thursday morning. Beverly's daughter had been married before. 8 years earlier, a quiet man, a teacher, who had married her in his mid-30s and separated 2 years later. The separation had taken everything. He left with debt attached to his name that he had not incurred, credit destroyed, a lease on a car he had never driven. He had filed a complaint with the state attorney's office that had been investigated briefly and closed without action. There was something else. Beverly herself had been through a long legal dispute with her first husband's family after his death. A dispute centered on the disposition of a trust he had established before the marriage. His family had alleged financial manipulation. The case had been settled privately. Beverly had retained most of the assets. This was not a marriage. This was a method. I sat with that information for 1 full day before I decided what to do with it. I called my son the following morning and asked him to meet me for breakfast, just the 2 of us. I chose the diner where his father and I used to take him on his birthday, the one with the yellow booths and the coffee that was never good but always right. He came in looking tired in a way that a night's sleep does not fix. He ordered without looking at the menu because men who have lost choices often stop deliberating over small ones. I waited until the coffee came. Then I put everything on the table, not loudly, not dramatically. I spoke the way I had learned to speak in 30 years of uncovering what people had tried to bury. Clearly, with evidence, with dates and documents and the names of the accounts he may not have realized he had signed away. He was quiet for a long time. He said, "I knew something was wrong, but I thought it was me." I told him it was not him. He said, "I thought I was losing my mind." She told me I was too sensitive, too attached to things that didn't matter. I told him that was also not true. He put his hands flat on the table the way his father used to do when he was steadying himself, and he looked at me, and I saw my son for the first time in 2 years. Not the careful, managed version, not the one who checked faces before speaking, the one I had raised. He asked me what we were going to do. I told him we were going to do this carefully, correctly, and completely. I told him he was not going to confront anyone. Not yet. I told him to keep going about his days as normal for the next 3 weeks while I set up everything we needed. He asked if I was sure. I told him I had spent my career undoing exactly this kind of structure, and I had never lost. He looked at me for a long moment, and then something crossed his face. Not relief. Something quieter. Permission to trust himself again. The next 3 weeks were the hardest kind of work. Not because it was complicated, but because I had to stay calm while knowing my son was going home every night to a situation I was dismantling around the edges. I coordinated with the family attorney. I gathered certified copies. I prepared a filing package that documented the timeline, the accounts, the power of attorney, the pattern established by the prior marriage, and the trust dispute. I contacted the attorney who had originally represented Beverly's first husband. He was still angry. He cooperated. I also prepared something that had nothing to do with the law. I wrote down, in careful and specific language, exactly what had been done to my son. Not what had been done financially. What had been done to the man. The systematic reduction of a person who had once rearranged furniture at age 10 because he believed space affected mood. The silencing of a voice that used to call his mother every Sunday morning just because he wanted to talk. The erasure of a man who believed buildings could tell the truth, slowly convinced that his own instincts were liabilities to be managed. I wrote it because someone needed to say it plainly, and because my son needed to read it when the time was right. He came to stay with me on a Wednesday. He did not tell her he was leaving. He took 2 bags and his drafting portfolio, and he drove to my house and sat at the kitchen table while I made coffee. The good kind. The way his father used to make it. That evening, the calls began. First from her, then from Beverly. I did not answer. My son sat at the table and listened to the voicemails play and did not move. Beverly's voice was controlled and precise. She used words like impulsive and manipulated, as if my son were a child who had been led astray rather than a grown man who had finally found the door. He looked at the phone and then at me. "She sounds exactly like she always did," he said quietly. Why did I think that sounded like love? I told him that was the most important question he would ever answer. The legal process moved forward. The filings were made. The accounts were reviewed. The power of attorney was successfully challenged on grounds I will not detail here, except to say that the language had been deliberately broad in ways that crossed specific lines. There were consequences. None of them were quick or cinematic. They were slow and bureaucratic and thorough, which is the only kind of consequence that actually holds. Beverly hired an attorney who sent letters describing my son as emotionally unstable and under my undue influence. I kept every letter. I responded to none of them personally. My attorney did that, cleanly and without drama. Her daughter tried once to reach my son directly. She appeared at his firm on a Thursday morning. She was composed. She told him she loved him. She told him I had poisoned him against his own marriage. She told him that what they had built together was real, and that walking away from it would destroy everything. He listened. And then he said something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. He said, "I remember who I was before I met you. I'd like to get back to him." Then he walked back into the building. The divorce took 14 months. The financial resolution took longer. What he recovered was not everything he had entered with, but it was enough to start. More importantly, What he recovered that no document could quantify was the thing I had watched disappear piece by piece over 3 years. The steadiness, the ease, the willingness to take up his own space. The community center he had wanted to design, the one she had told him was a distraction, he completed it 2 years after the divorce was final. I went to the opening. I stood in the back of the room and watched him walk through the space he had built, touching the walls lightly, explaining the angles of the windows to the neighborhood kids who had come to see their new building. He laughed without checking anyone's face first. His father would have walked through every room twice. It has been 3 years since the morning he sat at my kitchen table with 2 bags and his portfolio. He lives 20 minutes from me now. He calls on Sunday mornings again, sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes for an hour. He is seeing someone, slowly and on his own terms, a woman who argues with him about structural theory over dinner and calls him out when he is wrong and never once asks him to be smaller. He told me recently that the hardest part was not the legal process. It was unlearning the belief that his instincts were wrong, that the voice in his head that had been telling him something was off. For months, maybe years, was not anxiety or weakness but wisdom. He told me that the most dangerous thing she had ever done was convince him that the truest part of himself was a flaw to be corrected. I have thought about that often since he said it. About how control works not by taking things from people directly, but by convincing them those things were never theirs to keep. Their voice, their confidence, their right to take up space in their own life. I am telling this story because there are mothers and fathers who are watching their children disappear into marriages that look fine from the outside. Fine is the most dangerous word in the language. Fine means I have stopped expecting more than this. Fine means I have learned not to want what was taken from me. If you are watching someone you love become quieter, more careful, more apologetic for existing, do not tell yourself it is just marriage. Do not tell yourself they are adjusting. Pay attention to the silences where their voice used to be. Before I go, I want to leave you with what this taught me. First, financial control is domestic abuse. It does not leave marks on the body, but it dismantles a person with the same precision as any other form of violence. Second, when someone you love starts answering questions with "we" when they mean "I," that is worth paying attention to. Third, documentation is not betrayal. It is love that takes the long view. Fourth, the people who design these systems rely on the target's decency. They count on the person being too kind, too fair, too willing to believe the best, to name what is happening. Naming it is the first act of recovery. Fifth, leaving is not failure. Leaving is the moment the person decides their life belongs to them again. And that decision, made once, clearly and without apology, changes everything. If this story found you at the right moment, you are not alone. What part of it stayed with you? And what city are you watching from tonight?